The machines arrived on a Sunday, 14 of them. Sewing machines, vintage ones, in a range of states from merely broken to comprehensively destroyed, deposited in the shed at the end of the garden of the house on Linden, closed sometime between Saturday evening when Tobena Achike had locked the shed door and Sunday morning when he opened it and found them stacked along the south wall in a configuration that suggested careful unloading rather than casual disposal. Someone had wanted them to fit. He stood in the shed doorway with his coffee and looked at them. There was a 1952 Singer 201 with a cracked presser foot lever, a Benina 730 that appeared to have been dropped from a considerable height onto its left side. Two PFAF 130s in varying states of mechanical complaint, a 1947 Jones family rotary with rust on the bobbin case that had progressed from cosmetic to structural, a treadle machine in parts, the treadle separate from the cabinet separate from the head missing its needle bar, a Husqvarna Viking that had at some point been stored somewhere wet, three machines whose brand plates had been removed and whose identity required examination, two Japanese machines from the 60s, whose condition he assessed in under a minute as repairable with patience and parts. The 14th was under a tarpaulin in the corner. He pulled the tarpaulin back. It was a 1961 Elna Supermatic in a carrying case that was intact and latched. He opened the case. The machine inside was dusty but complete, and when he applied tension to the handwheel, it moved with the smoothness of something that had been stored properly rather than used carelessly. The bobbin window was functional. The various attachments were present in their case pockets. He closed the case. He looked at the other 13 machines. He went back inside and made his son's breakfast. His name was Tobena Achike, and the shed on Linden Close was his, and the machines in it were not, and he had an approximate idea of who had put them there. There was one person in his life who thought this kind of thing was funny. Her name was Delia, and she was his next-door neighbor, and she was 53 years old and had been managing the estate of a recently deceased relative for 6 months, and had mentioned on at least 2 occasions in the past month that the estate included a significant quantity of sewing machines that she did not know what to do with, and that her estate attorney had advised her could not simply be left at the curb without triggering some category of local ordinance she did not want to trigger. Delia was a secondary school deputy headteacher who had spent 30 years managing the practical realities of institutions with the dry efficiency of someone who has processed too many human situations to find most of them remarkable, and she had a quality of wit that expressed itself in practical jokes of a particular kind, the kind where the punchline was also the problem that needed solving, and where the person being pranked was specifically chosen because she believed, usually correctly, that they were the person most likely to solve the problem rather than be defeated by it. She had put 14 sewing machines into Benna's shed because she thought it was funny, and because she thought he would know what to do with them, and she had been right about both, which was the satisfying outcome that her better practical jokes tended to produce. He had said, on the second occasion she had mentioned the machines, that he might know someone who could assess them. He had not expected her to interpret this as an invitation to put them in his shed. He called her at 10:30. She said, "Happy Sunday." He said, "There are 14 sewing machines in my shed." She said, "I know. Did you see the Elna?" He said, "Yes." She said, "I thought you'd like the Elna." He said, "Delia." She said, "I thought you'd say yes anyway when I asked. And I didn't want to ask, so I just did it." She said this in the cheerful register of someone who is aware that what she has done is slightly unreasonable and has decided to lean into it rather than away from it. She said, "If you really don't want them, I'll have them collected." But I thought. He said, "What did you think?" She said, "I thought you'd know what to do with them." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I need to call someone." She said, "Let me know if there's anything good." If you are watching this from a city where a shed full of someone else's problem turned out to be the beginning of something real, drop it in the comments below. Subscribe and ring the bell, because this one is about what happens when the right person is given the right raw material, even if the method of delivery was somewhat irregular. Stay with me. Tobena Achike had grown up in Enugu State in Nigeria, in a house where his grandmother had kept 2 sewing machines, a Singer hand crank for everyday work, and a treadle machine she had inherited from her own mother that she treated with a reverence usually reserved for objects of religious significance. She had been a seamstress in the specific West African tradition of the term, which is to say she had been someone whose work shaped how people in a community presented themselves to the world, who understood fabric the way a musician understands pitch, as a material with properties and possibilities that most people could not hear, but that were perfectly audible to someone who had spent decades learning to listen. His grandmother had worked in the space between the utilitarian and the ceremonial that West African textile practice inhabits in a way that European fashion theory does not fully account for, where the garment is not merely clothing but a statement of status and occasion and belonging that is legible to the people in the community and opaque to those outside it. She had made funeral clothes, and naming ceremony clothes, and wedding clothes, and the ordinary good dress that a woman wore to church on Sundays, and each category had its own logic and its own demands, and she had moved between them with the fluency of a person for whom the language was native. Tabena had grown up watching her make these movements, and had absorbed the understanding that fabric was not simply material, but was communicative. That what you chose and how you worked it and what you made from it was a form of speech, with a grammar that was learnable, and a vocabulary that was accumulated through practice. His grandmother had taught him to sew before she taught him to read, which was not sequential exactly, but was chronological in the sense that the needle had preceded the pencil by approximately 18 months, and that his hands had understood the logic of stitch and tension before his eyes had understood the logic of letters on a page. He had grown up with the machines as domestic furniture and the work they produced as the visible expression of a specific intelligence that he had absorbed through proximity without being able to name it. The way children absorb music in households where music is always present. He had studied textile design at the Enugu State University of Science and Technology, which had given him a technical vocabulary for what he had understood intuitively, the language for discussing the relationship between fiber and structure and finish that he had known experientially since childhood but had not had precise words for. He had come to England at 26 on a postgraduate scholarship at the Royal College of Art, where he had spent 2 years in the fashion program working primarily on construction and material research, the engineering side of clothing rather than the styling side, and had been supervised by a faculty member who had described his thesis project, an investigation into the structural properties of traditional kente weaving techniques and their application to contemporary tailoring, as the most technically rigorous piece of student work she had supervised in 11 years. He had stayed in England after the scholarship because the work was there, specifically at a fabric and textile consultancy in London, where he had worked for 7 years assessing and sourcing materials for fashion brands and theatrical costumiers and occasional museum conservation projects, the kind of work that required deep knowledge of historic textiles and an ability to move between the very old and the very new without treating either as a reference point for the other. The consultancy had given him 2 things beyond the technical knowledge, which was already formidable. It had given him a professional network that operated at a level of specificity that most people in the fashion industry did not access, the network of mills and dye houses and archive keepers and conservators who understood fabric at the level of its fiber and its construction and its history, rather than at the level of trend and season and visual effect. And it had given him a perspective on the fashion industry that was useful in a critical way, the perspective of someone who understood what the industry was working with materially and who could therefore see clearly where the industry's treatment of material was inconsistent with the material's actual properties and possibilities. He had seen fabric handled in ways that were beautiful and fabric handled in ways that were dishonest, and he had developed in 7 years a clear sense of the difference, which was the difference between a garment in which the material was doing what it was suited to do and a garment in which the material was being asked to perform an effect that the construction was fighting against. The first kind held. The second kind did not. Not over time, not through washing, not through the ordinary use that clothing is subjected to, when the person who bought it wears it because they love it, rather than because it is a statement. He had left the consultancy and moved to the town on Linden Close 4 years ago when his daughter, Amara, was 3 years old. For reasons that were practical and that he did not often explain in full. The reasons were not complicated. The consultancy work was good and the salary was sufficient, and the professional world it situated him in was the right professional world, and all of those things were true while also being insufficient, which was the specific arithmetic of professional satisfaction that produces over time, the decision to leave. He had wanted to build something of his own, using what he knew, rather than to continue using what he knew to build things for other people. He had also understood that the building would require time and flexibility that the consultancy structure would not permit, and that the moment to start building was before the children were older rather than after, when the school years would produce a different kind of structure, but not a more available one. The building had been slower than he had planned, and more complicated than he had planned, and also more interesting than he had planned, which was the other arithmetic that the decision had produced, the one that made the slower and more complicated tolerable. His son, Chidi, had come 2 years after that, in the way that things sometimes arrange themselves when you have moved somewhere and stopped expecting them to. Amara was 7 now, and Chidi was 2, and they were both present in his life with the completeness that children are present when they are young, and a parent is the organizing fact of their existence. The children's mother, Neoma, had been in Tobena's life for 6 years, and in the children's for all of theirs, and had returned to Nigeria for her own reasons 2 years prior, in an arrangement that was ongoing, and which Tobena had accepted with the equanimity of someone who has learned that not all arrangements resolve the way they were planned, and that equanimity is not the same as indifference. She called the children every Sunday morning. Tobena answered her questions about Chidi with the completeness of someone who understands that information about a child belongs to both parents regardless of the geographical arrangement. He did not discuss the arrangement further than was required. He had been running a small alterations and repair service from the shed on Linden Close since the previous autumn, not as the main work, but as the work that was always available, the work that filled the hours between the consulting projects that came intermittently, and the school runs and the evenings with the children. He had 2 domestic sewing machines and an overlocker and tools and an understanding of what broken machines could be made to do and what they could not. The woman he had thought of calling when he looked at the 14 machines was named Ruth Osai. She was a textile conservator who worked between London and Edinburgh and who had been his colleague at the consultancy for 3 of his 7 years there, a woman of enormous technical knowledge and the particular kind of confidence that comes from knowing something so completely that the knowing has stopped requiring any external validation. She had grown up in a household not unlike his grandmother's, in Accra, with fabric as an organizing presence, and had come to conservation work through a route that had included museum studies and fine art training, and 2 years at a conservation institute in Florence, and the combination produced a perspective that moved between the technical and the contextual without losing either. She was also the person who had, over the years since they had both left the consultancy, sent him the clients she could not take and the jobs she did not want, in the understanding that the referral would produce correct work, and that the referral going to Tobena rather than elsewhere was a form of quality control. He called her and described the machines. She listened. She said, "Tell me about the Elna again." He told her. She said, "That's a 1961 Supermatic with the original attachments." He said, "Yes." She said, "In what condition?" He said, "I'd need to service it." "Cosmetically intact, mechanically I think functional. The handwheel has the right feel." She said, "A 1961 Supermatic in restored working condition with the original attachments in the case is not a 20-pound shed machine." He said, "I know." She said, "What's the Jones?" He said, "Structural rust on the bobbin case. The rest is fair." She said, "The Bonina." He said, "Dropped. I haven't opened the cover plate. If the hook timing has shifted, it's a rebuild. If it hasn't, it's a repair." She said, "And the faffs?" He said, "Both manageable, I think. I need to get into them." She said, "What are you planning to do?" He said, "I don't know yet. That's why I called you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what a working Supermatic sells for?" He said, "I know what the listings say." She said, "You also know that the listings are not what a working Supermatic with its original attachments in documented provenance sells for." He said, "I know." She said, "You have at least 3 machines there that restored are collectibles. The Supermatic, the Jones if the rust is surface where it matters, and the 201 is a 201. He said, "I know it's a 201. She said, "So, what are you planning?" He said, "I'm planning to understand what I have before I decide what to do with it." She said, "That sounds like you." She said, "Call me when you've gotten into them." He got into them over the following 3 weekends, with Amara present for portions of 2 of the 3, because she had decided that the shed was interesting and had declared this in the way she declared things, without ceremony and without asking permission, by arriving in the shed in her coat and boots and sitting on the spare stool at 7:45 on a Saturday morning and watching. She did not ask to help with the machines themselves. She watched. She had her mother's quality of observation, the specific kind of attention that holds what it sees without comment until the comment is appropriate. And she applied it to the machines in the shed with the same quality she applied to most things. She had, Tobena had noticed over the past year, a developing eye for craft, in the specific sense of an eye that could distinguish between work that had been done carefully and work that had been done well, and work that had been done both carefully and well, and could distinguish the 3 states before she had language to describe what she was seeing. She had looked at a jacket he had altered for a client in October and said, "You fixed the collar differently than the original," and she had been correct. The original collar had been poorly set, and he had corrected it as part of the alteration rather than simply matching the original's deficiency. And she had seen the correction from the outside without knowing what she was seeing, only that something was different and that the difference was an improvement. He had told her what she had seen. She had nodded once and gone back to her drawing. On the second Saturday, she said, "This one is different from the others." He was working on the Benina. He said, "Which one?" She pointed to the Elna in its case, which he had not opened again since the first day. He said, "Yes. That one is the best of them." She said, "How can you tell without opening it?" He said, "I opened it. The first day." She said, "Oh." She looked at the closed case. She said, "What makes it the best?" He told her, in terms he judged she could use, which was a judgment he made every time he answered a question from Amara, and which required more precision than answering most adults, because Amara noticed when the answer was simplified and found the simplification unsatisfying. She listened. Then she said, "So the other ones are also good, but in different ways?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And you're going to fix them all?" He said, "I'm going to assess them all. Fixing depends on what I find." She considered this distinction and appeared to find it acceptable. He found, over the 3 weekends, the following. The Elna was, as he had suspected, functional with service, the original attachments complete, including the buttonholer and the blind hem foot, and the gathering attachment and the zigzag plate. The Singer 201 needed a new presser foot lever and a timing adjustment that an hour of careful work produced. The Jones required more than he had hoped, the rust having progressed to the hook race in a way that required a replacement part he would need to source, but the replacement part was sourceable. The Benina had survived the drop with the hook timing intact and required repair rather than rebuild. The 2 Fafs were both functional with service. The 3 unbranded machines resolved on examination into a Toyota, a Janome, and something he could not immediately identify. All of them mid-century Japanese machines of varying quality, all of them repairable. The Husqvarna had water damage to the motor winding that made it, alone among the 14, genuinely uneconomic to restore. The treadle machine in parts was incomplete in a way that would require research and time, but was not impossible. The 2 remaining machines were a 1958 New Home and a brother from approximately 1965, both in fair condition and both straightforward. He wrote up the assessments in a notebook he kept for the purpose, organized by machine and by the work required and the likely outcome. He called Ruth back. She said, and he read her the assessments. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "I've been thinking about that." She said, "Tell me." He said, "I have 14 machines in various states of working order. I have the skills to restore them. I have a client base in textile and fashion that I've been underserving because I've been doing piecework instead of product." He paused. He said, "And I've been thinking for 2 years about whether there's a way to build something around the intersection of the machines and the fabric and the construction methodology that I've spent 20 years developing." She said, "A brand." He said, "Something like that." She said, "Built on what?" He said, "On the machines as the production method and the material research as the point of difference. Small runs. Documented production." the argument that the way something is made is part of what it is. She said, "That's not a new argument in fashion." He said, "No, but most of the people making it are doing so at a price point that excludes the people I grew up among, and with a visual language that references European craft history rather than the craft history that actually formed me." He said, "There is a version of slow fashion that is slow fashion for people who have always been able to afford the best and are now being offered the best with a conscience attached to it. That's not wrong. But it's not what I'm trying to do." She said, "What are you trying to do?" He said, "I'm trying to make garments that carry the argument in the construction itself. Not just in the labeling or the marketing. The argument should be visible to someone who knows how to look, in the way the seams are finished, and in the way the fabric is cut to honor its direction, and in the way the machine's particular capabilities have shaped what the piece is." He said, "And I want to make them at a price that is fair to the work, without being used as a signal of exclusivity." Ruth said, "That's a harder commercial proposition than the version you're not doing." He said, "I know." She said, "And you're going to do it anyway." He said, "I'm going to try to." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to see what you make." He said, "I'll send you something when I have something to send." She said, "And the machines? Are you keeping them?" He said, "I'm keeping the ones I need." He said, "The Supermatic I'm keeping, the 201 I'm keeping, the Jones when the part comes. The Bonina." She said, "That's 4. He said, "That's 4 production machines and 10 machines that go back to Delia when I've assessed what they're worth and she's decided what she wants to do." Ruth said, "Does Delia know yet what she started?" He said, "I don't think so." She said, "When will you tell her?" He said, "When I have something to show her." He had something to show her 14 months later, which was not the timeline he had imagined when he had told Ruth he would show her something when he had something to show. Because timelines in a business being built between school runs and evenings and consulting projects that did not stop coming simply because he had decided to build something else tend to be longer than the person building them anticipates. He had not been unhappy about this. He had been building correctly rather than quickly. Because correctly was the only kind of building that produced the outcome he was interested in. The 14 months had contained, in order, 6 months of machine restoration that ran alongside the material sourcing, during which he acquired through his consultancy network a collection of fabrics that were not the fabrics available through the usual wholesale channels, but were fabrics with documented histories, an end of run from a mill in Huddersfield that had been weaving a particular weight of wool for a century, a bolt of Ghanaian kente adjacent cotton that had been made by a weaver he had known through a museum conservation project, and that had structural properties suited to the tailoring he was developing, a Japanese selvage cotton from an Osaka mill, whose owner had been a client of the consultancy and who had agreed to sell directly. 3 months of pattern development that was the most technically demanding part of the work, in which the construction method had to be adapted to honor both the material's properties and the machine's characteristics, because the machines were not simply production tools, but were in the brand's argument participants in the work, and the argument required that the participation be genuine. 2 months of sampling and revision that had produced 3 pieces he had kept and 6 he had set aside and learned from. 3 months of final construction and photography and the building of the website and the writing of the text that would explain what the work was and why it was that way. What he had 14 months later was the first collection, 9 pieces, made on the 4 machines he had kept from Delia's shed, from fabric he had sourced through the network he had built across 20 years of textile work, fabric with documented provenance from mills in West Yorkshire and Kumasi and Osaka that he could speak about with the specificity that the collection's argument required. The 9 pieces were photographed in his sitting room by a photographer, friend named Adeze, who understood what he was trying to do and who had come from London on a Saturday and spent 6 hours producing images that were correct in the way that images are correct when the person making them and the person making the subject are thinking about the same problem. He had a website. He had the images on it and the text he had written about the project, which was specific and honest and did not try to be more than it was, and the pieces were for sale at prices that reflected what they were, which was garments made by someone with 20 years of material knowledge on machines that were part of the production's argument. The first 3 pieces sold in the first 2 weeks, 2 through the website and 1 through Ruth, who had bought it herself and then photographed it on a colleague and sent the photograph to 6 people she trusted and told them what it was and where to find it, with a note that said simply, "This is the work I've been waiting to see from this person for 10 years, and it is worth your attention." And the 6 people she had sent it to were the 6 people whose textile knowledge and professional judgment she most respected, and who were the kind of people whose attention, once given, tended to bring other attention. 6 months after that, the brand had been written about by 3 publications, and Tobena had 12 pieces in a small boutique in Edinburgh that Ruth had introduced him to, and 4 pieces in a boutique in London that had found him through one of the publications, and had sent a buyer to his shed on Linden, Close, who had spent 2 hours looking at the work and touching the fabric before placing the order. The buyer from the London boutique had asked him, at the end of the 2 hours, whether the machines he worked on were his. He had said, "4 of them are. The others I returned to the neighbor who had them originally." The buyer had looked at the 4 machines, the Supermatic in its case on the shelf, the 201 under its cover, the Bernina and the Jones side by side on the long workbench. She had said, "You should tell this story." He had said, "I'm not sure the story is mine to tell entirely." She had said, "Who else's is it?" He had thought about this. He had said, "There's a neighbor who put 14 broken machines in my shed on a Sunday morning and thought it was funny." The buyer had looked at him. He had said, "It was funny. In retrospect, it's also the beginning of the story." Delia had known something was happening for most of the 14 months, because she lived next door and the shed had lights in it at hours that the shed had not previously had lights in it, and because Tobena had mentioned, on the occasion of returning 10 of the machines to her with their assessments and a suggested disposition for each, that he was working on something using the 4 he had kept. She had said, "What kind of something?" He had said, "I'll show you when it's ready." She had said, "Are the 10 I'm getting back worth anything?" He had shown her the assessments. 2 of them were worth something, specifically the Brother from 1965 in fair condition, which she could sell through an online marketplace or through a dealer he could name if she wanted a reference, and a Genome that had turned out to be in better condition than the cosmetics had suggested and that would sell through the same channels. The other 8 were worth reconditioning costs if she had the patience and nothing more. And he had said so plainly because plain was the appropriate register. She had sold the 2 and donated the 8 to a community textile project she had found online, and she had mentioned to Tobena that the donation had generated a tax acknowledgement that partially offset the estate handling costs, and that she was pleased about this. He had said, "Good," she had said, "and the 4 you kept." He had said, "I'll show you when it's ready." On the Thursday evening after the buyer from London had visited, Tobena knocked on Delia's door. She opened it and looked at him and said, "It's ready." He said, "Yes." She came to the shed. He showed her the 4 pieces he had kept from the Edinburgh sale, which the boutique had agreed to loan back for an evening, because Ruth had asked, and Ruth had the relationship. He laid them on the long workbench under the good light. She looked at them for a long time. She picked up the piece he had made on the Elna, the one that used the gathering attachment in a way that was structural rather than decorative, and that had been the piece Ruth had bought first, and held it with both hands. She turned it and looked at the inside of the seam allowance, which she was not equipped to assess technically, but which she could see was finished differently from any garment she owned, with a precision that was visible even to someone who did not know what she was looking at. She said, "My aunt sewed for 60 years on those machines." He said, "I know. I could tell when I was servicing them. Machines hold what's been done on them in a way that's readable if you know how to read it." The Elna had been used with care and maintained with care. Someone who loved it had been working on it. Delia looked at the piece for a moment longer. She said, "You made this on the machines from the shed." He said, "On 4 of them." She said, "My aunt's machines." He said, "Your aunt's machines." She said, "I thought it was a funny joke." He said, "It was a funny joke." She said, "And then?" He said, "And then I opened the Elna." She held the piece for a moment longer and then set it back on the workbench. She said, "I should have asked first. Before putting them in your shed." He said, "Yes," she said, "I'm sorry about that." He said, "The apology is accepted." He said, I want to say something else. She said. Please, he said. The machines were the beginning of it. But the beginning of it was possible because of what I already knew and what I had already built, and what you gave me was the occasion rather than the cause. He paused. He said, I want you to understand the distinction, because the credit for what this is belongs to the work that preceded the Sunday. She looked at him. She said, You're being very generous. He said, I'm being accurate. Those are not always the same thing. She said, They're not. She looked at the pieces on the workbench. She said, What's it called? He said the name, which was a word in Igbo that referred to a specific quality of making, the making that comes from the hands and the mind working together rather than separately, a word his grandmother had used about her own work and that Tobena had been holding in reserve for the right application. Delia said the word back to him, approximately correctly. He said, Yes, she said, it suits it. He said, I thought so. Amara was at the table the following morning, eating her breakfast with the focused attention she brought to breakfast. When Tobena came down from getting chidi, she said, Was that Mrs. Delia last night? He said, Yes, she said. Did you show her the collection? He said, Yes, she said. What did she think? He thought about this for a moment. He said, She thought it was good, and she apologized for putting the machines in the shed without asking. Amara looked at her toast for a moment. She said, She should have asked. He said, Yes, she said. But the machines were good. He said the machines were very good. She thought about this. She said, So the mistake turned out to be useful. He said, A lot of things do. She looked at him with the assessing quality that was her mother's applied to her father's face and appeared to find this answer adequate, and she went back to her breakfast. He made Chidi's porridge and stood at the counter while the porridge cooled and thought about his grandmother's 2 machines and the treadle and the singer, and about the 14 machines in the shed and the 4 that remained, and about what it meant to be given the raw material you needed in a form and a manner you had not anticipated, and about what you had to already be in order for the raw material to find its right use. He thought about the Elna in its case with the original attachments and the handwheel that moved correctly, and about the way Delia had described her aunt as someone who had sewn for 60 years on those machines, and about the way his grandmother had moved between the singer and the treadle without ceremony, each having its appropriate use for a specific task, and about how the knowledge of what each machine could do and could not do was itself a form of knowledge that was not transferable except through use, and that the machines in Delia's shed had been waiting for someone who had that knowledge in the way that materials wait for the right hands. He thought that the right hands were not a matter of luck, but a matter of preparation, and that the preparation had begun in Enugu State before he had words for what he was preparing for. Chidi reached up from his chair and patted the counter twice, which was how he indicated that something was ready to be attended to. Tobena attended to it. The morning continued.